Hello everyone, welcome to the second part of my discussion on Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. In the first part, I have tried to make a sort of background study of the text and also tried to look into the various motives that might have worked for Coleridge to write the text, and also tried to demarcate in a way how Coleridge was different from Wordsworth in his conception of poetry, as well as in his ideas about various aspects of literature. In this segment of my lecture, I will be concentrating on basically on the basic ideas that Coleridge has discussed in the Biographia Literaria, and also try to locate where Coleridge's notion of poetry and poetic diction was fundamentally different from that of Wordsworth. I would basically concentrate on Coleridge's idea of poetry and his idea of fancy and imagination, the concept of willing suspension of disbelief, and his idea of poetic diction. Now, coming to the text, the Biographia Literaria, which was originally titled as Biographical Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinions, came out first in 2 volumes in 1817. Coleridge wanted to write this text for a long time. I believe just after the publication of the lyrical ballads with his so-called manifesto, the preface. From that particular moment, Coleridge had a desire to write his own manifesto, because he felt, in spite of having collaborated with Wordsworth in the lyrical ballads and having written some of the passages in that famous preface as well, that his position was somewhat fundamentally different to that of Wordsworth, and that Wordsworth's Treatise of Art has some basic problems or lacunas which he wanted to address. He might have been also been inspired by the fact that Wordsworth had attempted to write a sort of autobiographical text, a text which would map his development as an artist in the poems like the Prelude or the Recluse. So the Biographia Literaria can be conceived to be a sort of a Coleridgean answer to that of Wordsworth's attempt of writing an autobiography. That is why initially this book, that is the Biographia Literaria, was conceived as an autobiography. For Coleridge, it is the autobiography of a philosopher, unlike Wordsworth, who wanted to write as a poet. It is because that after having come back from Germany, where he had studied the German philosophers in detail, and finding a tremendous interest in philosophy, there is a idea that got confirmed in Coleridge's mind, that he was more of a philosopher and that his poetic talent was not at par with that of the contemporary poets as well as his fellow friend Wordsworth, and it would be better for him to concentrate on philosophical interpretations of something and to be interested in philosophy rather than in literature. This might not be true, because as far as my estimate is concerned, if Coleridge would have persisted with the kind of poetic strain that he had exhibited in works like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner or the Kubla Khan, he would have been as great a poet as Wordsworth, if not better. So this text, that is the Biographia Literaria, was conceived as a literary autobiography, but it was structurally speaking, the book is too scrappy, and I would say suffers from a lack of cohesive unity to be called really an autobiographical text. It doesn't have the shape, it doesn't have the look of an autobiographical text, but the text definitely registers various influences that Coleridge has had in his entire life, from Aristotle to the German philosophers like Kant, like Fichte, and Schelling, as well as the great British philosophers like David Hartley and David Hume. So this book somewhat registers, the various impressions of that Coleridge had in his mind. But I believe that the poetic self that Coleridge wanted to suppress or wanted to ignore probably prevented him to write a completely philosophical piece that he wanted the Biographia Literaria to be, and it somewhat kind of shifted from being a philosophical doctrine to be a sort of treatise on art, because it is the poet in Coleridge that have kind of drifted towards the analysis of the poetic process. But it is an immediate norm for reading this particular text that the Biographia Literaria cannot be read in isolation with or in disconnection with the lyrical ballads, because from the very beginning this book is conceived in order to conceived by Wordsworth in order to kind of clarify his different position to that of Wordsworth, and he also wanted to sort of plug those gaps that he thought Wordsworth's philosophy depicted in the preface had. So this book has definitely connected with with Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads, and it has to be read in immediate connection with that. In fact, Coleridge has time and again said that he has written this book in order to sort of kind of give to demarcate his individuality as a theoretician as well as a poet. So we would study the concepts that Coleridge finally elaborates in this text in connection with that of Wordsworth, and we'll start our discussion of Coleridge's particular doctrines in relation with that of Wordsworth. In fact, there are certain basic propositions in Wordsworth's study that Coleridge had pointed out in his analysis. That is Wordsworth's experiment with a new style. Wordsworth, as all of you know, that in the lyrical ballads he has attempted a new kind of a poem, and he tried to give a manifesto for the new kind of a poem that he has written. Now, Coleridge had no objection to the new technique or the new style of poetry that Wordsworth and he himself have attempted, but he had a problem to the fact that to that assertion of Wordsworth that this poetic technique has to be universal and it has to be universally applied to almost all kinds of poetry. This is where he objected to that. This poetic philosophy may be applicable to the kind of poetry that Wordsworth is writing, but it cannot be universally applied to almost all the branches of poetry that are extant. That was one objection of Coleridge to Wordsworth's doctrine. Another point where Wordsworth differed Coleridge differed from Wordsworth is in its opposition of nature and art. Wordsworth's basic opposition of nature in various sense to art has been conspicuous in many of his writing. He believed poetic diction to be artful, to be artificial, and that poetic composition needs to be natural. Coleridge believed that this particular dialectic of nature versus art cannot be sustained for a long time, because I would say that the great, because according to Coleridge, the great poems are natural only in a sense which involves the very qualities of purpose. Every poem must have a purpose. If it is, the chief purpose is that to give delight, to provide delight, but it would definitely have a purpose, and this purpose would be presented, would be optimized, would be exemplified through different parts of the poem. And those parts would be conceived in a really purposive way, and that is why nature and on all those parts art cannot always be natural. It has to sometimes be conspicuously conscious of his own doings, of his own activity. So Coleridge's main opposition to Wordsworth was that, and this dichotomy of nature versus art doesn't get extended to almost every sphere, to almost every aspect of poetic composition. Rather, a poetic composition has to be seen as a combination of various parts, finally giving the shape of the whole. That is what Coleridge arrives at. Now, Coleridge begins his critique by explaining his ideas first of a poem, and secondly of poetry itself, in kind and in essence. For Wordsworth, in his doctrine of in the doctrine of Wordsworth that we have read in the preface, we have seen that Wordsworth has time and again changed his position relating to while he was trying to kind of accommodate the concept of poetic diction to that of poetry. The justification of poetic meter, for Wordsworth has proved to be a really tricky problem, because initially he has declared that meter or versification to be a sort of a artificial, to be a sort of an artifice and kind of unnatural thing, and it doesn't go with the natural language of feeling. But he could not also ignore the fact that the natural language of feeling may be broadly rhythmical, and the use of poetry of highly regular stress and stanza pattern would then seem a matter of nature. But his definition that he constantly has harped on, that poetic diction is artificial and it cannot be applied to poetry, which is a natural source of language, which is a natural expression of emotion. This particular aspect that kind of led Wordsworth to continuously change his position as a theoretician has been answered by Coleridge to a certain extent in his idea of a poem. He says that according to Coleridge, a poem are the supreme achievements of the creative mind, which can be of a creative mind, and it is the creative mind which is the central stage of making a poem, that is the chief fountainhead of all the emotions and the feelings for writing a poem. Here Coleridge is very much akin to the poet. But as far as this definition of the other aspects of poem is concerned, he differs from Wordsworth in the sense. And for that, I'll be quoting his pointed definition of a poem from the Biographia Literaria. I quote, "A poem is that species of composition which is opposed to works of science by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth, and from all other species it is discriminated by proposing to itself such delight from the whole as is compatible with a distinct gratification from each component part." So he defines a poem as a means to an object, purpose or end. Object, purpose or end for Coleridge is synonymous. Coleridge, in his tradition of neoclassical criticism, establishes that the making of a poem is a deliberate act. It cannot be spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, which Wordsworth has said. In an earlier lecture, he had put the matter in such a way as to bring in the expression of feeling, but under subordinate of deliberate purpose. Like Wordsworth, he has also prioritized the feeling in the matter of composing a poem. But for him, if the feeling, expression of feeling comes secondary to the purpose, every poem is written with a purpose. So that definite purpose kind of guides or self-selects all the other elements of poetry. So poems are a species of composition. When a poet is writing, he is very much aware that he is creating something which might have a lasting value and which has a definite purpose. And for Coleridge, the definite purpose is the purpose of giving pleasure and not truth. And that is how poetry is not only different from science or that of history. Poems are also different from fiction, as well as as well as prose, because he believed that poems are supreme achievements of the creative mind, which cannot be sustained only for the limited passages. So it is different from the fictional prose, where it goes on for a long time. So the main point that he's trying to arrive at is that a poem is a species of poetic composition. It is a deliberate act with a definite purpose, and the creative mind plays a big role, who sort of create a big role in kind of conceiving the poem. In fact, it is the central, it has a central role to play, and that is how Coleridge is almost echoing the basic sentiment of his own age of prioritizing the individual mind over anything else. But Coleridge also now goes to from a poem, how to create a poem, to the role of a poet, and I would come to now Coleridge's definition of a poet. Coleridge says, and I quote, "What is poetry? Is so nearly the same question with what is a poet, that the answer to the one is involved in the solution of the other, for it is a distinction resulting from the poetic genius itself. The poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity." Look, poet, I'm explaining, the poet described in ideal perfection brings the whole soul of man into activity. He diffuses a tone, he brings all the faculties of man into one place, that is a poem. He has this power of fusion. Again I quote, "He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and fuses each into each by the synthetic and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination." A poet does have a special quality which makes him fuse, synthesize, kind of blend, diffuse various elements within his own creative arena, and create a sort of magical effect, a sort of effect which later Coleridge explains as the willing suspension of disbelief, by creating this balance between various reconciled various elements. I quote, "This power, this magical power that Coleridge has talked about, reveals itself in the balance of reconciliation of opposite of discordant qualities." Now, he specifies that a poet is a person who brings the whole soul of the man into activity. That means he brings all the senses, his intellect, his feeling, his emotion, and his senses into one activity, that is that is creation. Then he had this tremendous ability of fusing. In the next part of my lecture, I'm going to discuss about this special activity of the special quality of the poet, which he terms as imagination, specifically secondary imagination, or as asymptotic plastic imagination, and I will try to sort of define it in its relation with the concept of fancy and the concept of willing suspension of disbelief, just in the next part of my lecture. Thank you. Hello everyone, welcome to the second part of my discussion on Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. In the first part, I have tried to make a sort of background study of the text, and also try to look into the various motives that might have worked for Coleridge to write the text, and also try to demarcate in a way how Coleridge was different from Wordsworth in his conception of poetry, as well as in his ideas about various aspects of literature. In this segment of my lecture, I will be concentrating on